Hey everyone, it's Rob, and thanks for listening in today. I greatly appreciate your time. Today, I chat with Casey Fiesler about ethics and diversity in technology and why we should be aware of the importance of this topic. Casey is an assistant professor and founding faculty in the Department of Information Science at the University of Colorado Boulder, where she researches and teaches in the areas of technology ethics, internet law and policy, and online communities. She is also a public scholar and a frequent commentator and speaker on topics of technology ethics and policy, as well as women in STEM, including consulting with Mattel on their computing-related Barbies, which you'll hear more about during our chat. She's originally from Atlanta, and she holds a PhD from Georgia Tech in human-centered computing and a JD from Vanderbilt University Law School. So, without further ado, please enjoy this very important topic with Casey. Casey, great to see you today. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
You're in my favorite place in the world, Boulder, Colorado.
I am.
What's happening there right now?
Well, I'm not sure it's as much on fire as
fires and
snow.
right.
There's a little bit of snow on the ground, but just a little.
Okay. And the sun's always shining, isn't it? Like 300 days a year or something?
Yes.
But I spoke with you before. You're from Georgia, and I feel like you maybe like that climate a little bit better.
You know, I find Georgia too hot. And
Too hot.
I prefer the weather here, though I did have to learn to drive in the snow.
Okay. Yeah, right. Learn to drive in the snow. Yeah, the people in the South, if it's like a little bit of snow or something, it shuts the whole city down.
Yep.
I'm excited to talk to you because you teach a really important subject at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I wanted to talk and start with this idea around ethics and technology. And can you share exactly what that is, first of all, and why is it important? Why is this an important topic nowadays?
Yeah, I think that actually ethics can be a sort of loaded term, and I don't know that it has a particular definition. Sometimes we talk about issues of responsibility, that, for example, the people who are designing our technology are being responsible and are thinking about potential harms. That's another way to think about ethics, is how can we help people more and hurt people less. Sometimes we're bringing in issues of justice and equity and these kinds of things. These are all sort of related concepts, but I think in the end, I tend to think about it as how can we design technology and build technology in ways that is going to do good for the world and less bad.
Right. And so is it doing some bad in the world right now? And I was kind of curious about the idea that we'd have to teach this. It never really occurred to me that when we have these amazing technology products, that there's this component that maybe we need to be thinking about. So is it doing bad? And then, where did we start to realize we actually had to start maybe teaching some of this?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I mean, certainly there have been technologies that have done harm for a very long time. I mean, one of a common core example in technology ethics classes was actually a radiation machine from decades ago, where a sort of flaw in the software design caused it to give people incorrect doses of radiation, and it ended up resulting in some people's deaths. And so this is an example that's used sometimes about careful software design and how to test things and that sort of thing. And so we've been thinking about these things for a long time. I think one of the differences maybe in terms of like why it's so much heavier in the public consciousness, like issues of tech ethics, it seems like more in the past decade than previously, I think is because technology is just so deeply embedded in our individual lives and in society. I mean, even now, like I have students in my class find news articles every week that are relevant to the class as an assignment. It's really easy. Like I could go onto Google News right now and find some tech ethics controversy that's happening somewhere in the world. And again, I think this is because we are so impacted by technology that these things are so important that they get talked about a lot. And I also think that, you know, teaching tech ethics has been talked about more in the past few years. Like people have been talking about how we're doing this, et cetera, but it's certainly not new. Maybe, you know, people weren't paying as much attention to how it was being taught, and it might be taught more now, but it's definitely not a new thing. When I was a graduate student at Georgia Tech, I taught a class that had been a required class for computer science students for at least 15 years, probably.
Mm-hmm. And you have your law degree from Vanderbilt.
Yeah.
And so were you going to practice law, or did you always intend to sort of utilize your law knowledge as it relates to teaching ethics and technology?
You know, that's a great question. So I did go to law school intending to be a lawyer. And, you know, and lots of people ask me advice now on whether they should go to law school. And I'm like, well, you should go to law school if you want to be a lawyer, and you probably shouldn't if you don't. So I did intend that. And I realized sort of halfway through law school that I was more interested in it as a scholarly discipline than I was in the practice of law. And my background from before that was actually in psychology and human-computer interaction, where I'd done a lot of research, experimental research, et cetera. And I realized that was what I really missed. So I decided to get my PhD in a computing field, in part because I actually thought that law and computing were the intersection of those two things was really kind of underdeveloped, particularly when it comes to empirical research. And that's why I decided to get a PhD. And then you know, my interest in policy, law and ethics are not the same thing by a long shot. But certainly lots of issues around the role of technology in society touches on both of those things. And I shifted really strongly towards ethics near the end of my PhD and at the beginning of my faculty career, in part because of this just sense of urgency.
So you had mentioned that you have your students look up online or bring an article or something about ethics in the world, something maybe going on that's super easy to find. What's an example of something that's going on right now that a regular person like me would have no idea?
Oh gosh, well, I can tell you what we talked about this week.
Okay.
So, you know, obviously the big thing that has just happened in the world is the US elections. And so one topic that was really strongly in the news in this past week that touched on a lot of things we've been talking about in class: misinformation, content moderation, decisions that social media platforms have to make. It were the moderation decisions that Twitter and Facebook were making around election misinformation. And so removing some content, flagging some content, and how they made these decisions was something that we talked about in class this week. And a lot of students brought in news articles about that.
Okay, so interesting. And we're just about, what are we, about a week after the election now. It's November 11th. And I noticed, I don't really follow too much social media, but I noticed during the election, I was looking at different things, and President Trump was tweeting, which he does regularly. And I did notice that they I don't remember what it said, but in his tweets, it said, it either sort of had a caveat about what he said, or it wouldn't allow the tweet to go through. Is this an example of what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Twitter in particular has a policy that they call their, I believe, civic integrity policy, where it is a violation of their policies to share misinformation about election procedures. So before the election, this was mostly things like, so for example, and this is something people have tried before, if someone tweeted, oh, the election has been postponed to November 4th, they would remove that content. But the other part of their policy was that you couldn't share content where you are misleading people about the outcome of an election. And so that was when President Trump tweeted that he won the election after it had been called for Joe Biden. They were flagging that content under that policy. They also have a policy that they don't remove content from political leaders, they just label it.
I see, they label it. And so is that ethical, and are they in a position to do that sort of thing, or are they just a platform and they should just stay out of that kind of thing?
So, I mean, this is a great question, and people will vastly disagree on the answer to that question, right? And I actually think that content moderation decisions are a huge policy/ethical issue right now, because people will, and this is a great example of why ethics is so challenging, and it's challenging to teach as well, and maybe challenging to learn for students, because there aren't right and wrong answers here, right? And it often has to do with how people value things differently. So one person will tell you that free speech is the most important value you could have. Another person would tell you that protecting people from hate speech or harassment is the most important value to have. And these platforms are having to make decisions about this. In my opinion, this decision about labeling content and trying to suppress its reach, because I believe they also, made it more difficult to share, seems like a reasonable kind of compromise against the value of, like, we should know what our political leaders are trying to say. And so both Twitter and Facebook did something similar. Facebook also put a note underneath the president's Facebook post about winning that said that the election had been called for Joe Biden. I think that both of these platforms in the past 4 years have done a lot of prep work to try to decide what they should do around the next presidential election, because there was so much criticism of how social media might have impacted the last one.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Mark Zuckerberg or Jack Dorsey, who I think is the founder and CEO of Twitter, along with somebody else that I can't remember, but you probably know. Do you think, when they first started this, like Mark Zuckerberg, it was going to be something for college students or something like that. And, sort of this, now in Twitter, where you'd have these quick messages or something. And now it's almost like they're a news source, and they have to operate on this whole different level. And where my question is going is, at the outset, they're young, and well, it may not even matter how old they are, but how do you even start thinking like, well, what if this becomes X, Y, or Z, and could actually start gaining attention from, like TikTok, like how TikTok is right now all of a sudden, or, something like that. It's kind of a fun, goofy thing for a while. And now it's like this really serious thing in some ways. How do you even start a company with that in mind?
That's such a great question, because I often use Facebook as an example of this exact kind of problem. I mean, before Facebook was even Facebook, it was like a website to rate the hottest girls at Harvard, and so when this platform was first built, I mean, the idea that someday it could be so deeply embedded in the social fabric of society that it could actually have an impact on democracy.
Right.
I mean, like that, it would have sounded ridiculous, right? And something that I think a lot about is this kind of ethical speculation in the design process, right? Like we should be thinking about things that could go wrong early and often and not waiting to see what goes wrong to fix it, because by then the harm's already done, right? In the case of Facebook, I obviously would not expect anyone to have known how this could go, but at some point along the way, the way that things could go should have become clear, right? And so sometimes you can't really foresee where a technology is going to go, and maybe it's a slow, gradual process, which can be really challenging. But I think that's a reason why, we need to be checking in and thinking about how things are going, and also making sure that revenue isn't the only sort of guiding metric for a technology. Because I mean, a lot of things when it comes to social media, decisions have been made based on how many eyeballs you're going to get on ads. And this leads to things like, I mean, YouTube got a ton of criticism for their algorithm pushing conspiracy theory videos. Like if you watched one flat earth video, you were going to see 20 flat earth videos. And that's because people were watching them, right? And so they had to make a conscious decision to change their algorithm such that certain kinds of content would not be recommended as strongly, which was, an ethical call, because I'm sure it did lead to some lost revenue, but sometimes you have to do what's right for the good of society.
Well, hopefully all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
A question that I'm curious about, and you and I spoke a little bit about before, is who's creating these products, and how are they representing the whole when they create the product?
Yeah, so, obviously there has been a lot of discussion about the tech workforce and diversity issues. Far more men than women, far more white people than people of color in the tech industry. Not a lot of representation from people with disabilities, for example, and not as much from LGBTQ people. One of the ways that I have thought about this lately is, what kinds of work are people who are in marginalized communities doing, and is it considered as like counting as computer science such that they could then get hired at these tech companies? Like my students and I have done some research recently where we talked to people who are doing these like awesome computational projects in their free time, and they're like, well, but I took a computer science class and it was boring. Like this isn't that. And so there's been this discussions for years about the pipeline problem in computer science education, that like, in elementary school, girls are actually quite interested in computer science and they sort of drop off along the way. And I think a lot of that has to do with messaging and also the environment. And I think that this is actually a big problem, in part because having more diverse voices in the room means that you are building better technology. Like there's just research that shows that more diverse teams are more creative. But also, who's probably really good at thinking about how a technology might be used to harass people, for example, people who get harassed a lot, which is not, a team full of white men.
Yeah, I mean, so let's use Facebook as an example. At a certain point, who could have thought maybe that it would be utilized as a tool in inner cities or in India? I have friends in India who talk about Facebook all the time, It's very common. I suppose it's common all over the world. I'm not smart enough to know that, but it's important that, say, here in America, as an example, or in India, as the other example, that society and that community is being represented for those very reasons.
Yeah, I mean, Facebook is actually hugely popular in lots of parts of the world. There are some developing countries where Facebook practically is the internet, in part because of access issues, and it's been built to work very well on mobile phones.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I mean, these policy decisions, for example, that platforms are making, they're not just made for people in the United States, for example.
Right. You by the way, Casey has an amazing and really fun YouTube page. So check that out. You do a really nice job with that. One of the videos you talked about a few different topics that really caught my attention. One of them being Zoom bombing, which we all got to kind of understand what that is during the pandemic. And I got thinking, how does something like that get overlooked when a product is being designed?
Yeah, that's a good question. The reason that Zoom bombing really stuck out to me was because when it first started happening, there was this interview with the CEO in the New York Times where he basically said, we didn't think about how people might misuse this technology.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and to some extent, you can understand that in the same ways that like Facebook was built for this thing and we didn't expect it to go to this place. And so Zoom really was built for like business conferencing. But I do think that a little bit of ethical speculation could have been built into this process, right? So, there were default settings in Zoom for, not having these kinds of safety features that now are by default. The fact that, public rooms were just I don't remember how many digits, but like a string of numbers that wasn't super long. So like you could sort of find yourself in public Zoom rooms by putting in different numbers, without a huge amount of work. Now they have changed some things so that there are settings that protect privacy more by default, but that happened in response to this problem. And, when I first saw this, I was thinking, I feel like if someone had asked me, how do you think awful people might use this technology if it became more widespread? Like, yeah, people coming into Zoom meetings and like yelling racial slurs, like I think is something that would have occurred to at least some people. And that's definitely what happened in this case. And I mean, lots of new technologies are immediately appropriated for being awful, unfortunately.
Yeah, and you also talk about what awful people being awful. I mean, what do you mean by that?
I mean, I certainly couldn't go into the psychology of why people do these kinds of things. But, in that video, like the example that I use from very early on is Lambda Moo, which was this text-based online community in the early 90s. And, immediately people figured out like how to upset people in that environment. And, there's been a lot of discussion more recently, and especially in the past decade or so, about online harassment, doxing, people sending SWAT teams to people's houses, people using social media to send constant death threats. We had Gamergate, which was, this extended harassment campaign against women in gaming.
And it's really hard to say like why people do these things. But we know that whatever new technology comes along, they're going to use it for
Yeah.
that.
It's amazing to me. And I sometimes I feel like I must be so naive. I watched a story on Real Sports, which is a show on HBO. And they were talking about the gaming industry and um, uh, these young kids. You know, it's a huge sport now. And this one kid, he made $3 million one year at one event, or I can't remember exactly. But he got so popular that when he would be playing the game online, the other kids would call the police, and the police would come in with a whole SWAT team, like you just mentioned. And there was video of it that they showed, and it was almost unbelievable. They broke into the house like there was a major situation going on. And I thought to myself, how can that happen? What?
I mean,
Yeah, go ahead.
So that's one of the sort of most severe examples. And gosh, what a horrible thing to do, right? I mean, I guess we could have this conversation about like, why do people rob banks, and why do like lots of bad behaviors that people have. But I think an important point here is that we know that there are bad people who, whatever new technology, I don't care what it is, Google Drive was used for harassing people, was another example I mentioned in that video.
Yes.
So this is going to happen. So when you are designing a technology, part of that design process should be thinking about how bad actors might use that technology, and then trying to design to make that more difficult.
Mm-hmm.
So, in user experience design, you often will create user personas where you're like, here's a kind of person who might be using our system, and how do we design for that use? So I think that we should also be creating negative user personas, like how is the abusive ex-partner stalking their ex going to be using this? And another user persona is like someone who's racist, or someone who really wants to harass people, or in the case of Zoom bombing, like people who think it's funny to show strangers their genitals. Like
right.
You should be thinking about those kinds of people as well. And instead of designing for them, you should be designing against them.
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. Can you explain what technical debt is?
Yeah. So technical debt means that when you're building a new technology, there are probably going to be some bugs. And often there's a push to release something quickly, right? Move fast and
get it out there. Right. Yes, you have a slide on one of your videos with that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so there's this idea that, we need to get this out. There's probably going to be some bugs. We don't know what they are yet, but as soon as this thing is out in the world, it'll become clear what the bugs are, and then we can fix them. So that is technical debt, this idea that like we're accruing some debt that we're going to have to pay back. And it's probably going to be slightly harder to fix the bugs than it would be now, but it's worth it because we need to push it out. So that is what technical debt is.
Is that fair? I mean, in a way, is it difficult to sort of plan for every sort of thing that, might happen, or is there a compromise? Like there's a middle ground, like you can't plan for everything, but plan for as much as you possibly can before you put it out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good point. So, my students and I have been thinking about this in terms of ethical debt, which is even harder, right? So like, it's not just a software bug, like, oh, that form isn't working in a couple of days.
Yeah.
Like, oh, like this technology is going to hurt people in some way, potentially. And we don't know what that way is going to be. But once it's out in the world, we'll see what harm happens or what impact it has on society that we're not anticipating. But the problem with that is that, like, the harm's already done, right? Like, the people who are Zoom bombed can't unsee whatever they saw, you know? I think you're absolutely right that it can be very difficult to foresee every eventuality. And obviously, I don't expect, you know, software designers to be clairvoyant. But I do think that doing some amount of ethical speculation during the design process is really important. You might, you know, you're certainly not going to catch everything, but you might think about some things. And you know, I don't know right now how common this is. You know, I definitely think that some tech companies and some designers are definitely doing this very well. And I think probably more so now in recent years, because I mean, honestly, when it comes to like, why should we think about ethics? Everything we talked about before about how there's constant controversies in the news, like if we don't want a PR disaster is the motivation that I can get, I'll take it.
Right. Right. You when we were researching, we came across a question that you posed about how we might feel about people like you monitoring our social media and whether we would mind that can happen, that's happening. So you're doing it for, say, like research purposes. You know, can you explain like more about that?
Yeah, so another thing that I've been researching for the past few years is data science and research ethics. So ethics of how computer scientists or even people in other fields are using public data in their research. So most people don't realize how common this is, but there are thousands and thousands of academic papers written that use tweets as a data set, for example, and you know, YouTube videos and all kind. I mean, anything that you put online could potentially be used for science, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. But you know, researchers, like, there's lots of ways that people think about research ethics, and like there's actual regulation of this for academic researchers, but this has kind of fallen into this gap in the regulation because it's just considered public. Like, oh, well, it's just, you know, it's there. Anyone can do whatever they want with it. And so I think that it's important that people are aware of all of the different ways that what they put online can be used. And it's not just like academic researchers, it's also things like facial recognition systems are being trained using public data. Clearview was, you know, a big example of this. It's this huge facial recognition system that's being used by law enforcement, and they basically just grabbed everyone's photos off the internet for this system. So I think it's important that people understand how their content might be used. The advice that I always give is like do social media. Like, I am very heavy on social media. I'm not going to tell people not to tweet, but I'm like, tweet like BuzzFeed is watching. Like, imagine that, you know, your tweet could end up in a BuzzFeed article or a scientific article or used to train facial recognition. And are you okay with that? And then on the other hand, I'm talking to researchers about what ethical heuristics they should be using about how to use this kind of content.
Just be thoughtful, I think, is what you're saying.
Yeah.
I want to go back to diversity for a second. We were introduced by one of my previous guests, Ruth Farmer, and she's involved with CS for All, which is Computer Science for All. And I think that is an organization that is trying to, bring more diversity into tech for youth, I think. Is that correct?
Yes, mostly they do K-12. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so, getting back to that, there was this really interesting story I read about Barbie dolls and about, could you share that story?
Yeah. I kind of wish I had my STEM Barbies here with me. They're at my office, which I haven't been to since March.
Okay.
Yeah. So when I was finishing up my PhD, so this was in 2014, Mattel got some bad PR because of this book that they released called Barbie, I Can Be a Computer Engineer. So a blogger had found a copy of this book and posted all of it online, and everyone was just going crazy because it was just bafflingly sexist. Like not even just a little bit. Like the basic plot of the book was that Barbie is at her computer and her sister comes over and is like, "Hey Barbie, what are you doing?" And Barbie says, "I'm making a game." And then her sister says, "Well, can I play it?" And Barbie says, "Oh, well, I'm not actually making the game. I'm just coming up with the design ideas, and I need Steven and Brian to turn it into a real game." And then she infects her computer with a virus and her sister's computer. She infects them both with viruses, and then the boys code the game and fix their computer. And then at the end, she's like, "Yay, I'm a computer engineer." I mean, it's really bad. So my dissertation was actually about copyright and fair use and remix. And so when I saw this, I was like, wow, one of the cool things about this whole controversy is that like there's probably going to be some really good memes about this. Like there's going to be remixes of the book. And then I thought, well, I'm procrastinating. Maybe I should do that. So I took all the pages of the book that this blogger had posted and I blanked all the text and rewrote a story using the same images. Barbie, now with less sexism. And it went really viral, which was kind of fun. And a little bit terrifying because my friends were like, "Aren't you afraid that you're going to get harassed?" Which did not happen as much as I might have expected, actually. So, sometimes things work out okay. But since then, a few years later, Mattel contacted me and asked if I would consult on a new book that they were working on. So, they actually definitely learned something from that experience. Like they immediately pulled the book from production. A couple of years later, they released a game developer Barbie. And then they did this coding book, like sort of coding unplugged. Here's how to get kids to think about computer science that I helped them with. So it's a good example of a failing forward.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's to me, it's fascinating on so many levels. One of them being, because this was 2014, correct?
Yes.
So it was just 6 years ago. And I'm sure it was all very well intended and really smart people at the company that were creating the product, and they were going through the book and they probably felt like the storyline was a really good one and they were proud of it. So it wasn't, I'm guessing, with malintent, right?
Yeah.
So they just didn't have that awareness. And do you feel like nowadays that would be less likely to happen? Do you feel like organizations are thinking about things a little bit more thoughtfully?
I would like to think so. I think that certainly conversations around discrimination and bias and inclusivity have really, they're just so at the forefront now that, I mean, again, even if companies are thinking about it in part because they want to make sure they're not screwing up, like even if it's not like out of some great goodness of their hearts, like I'll take it.
Right.
But I definitely think that seeing other companies be really lambasted for some of these things have shifted the culture a little bit. I mean,
you know, things still aren't perfect. But I think we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah. Good. That's a good positive note to end on. And Casey, I want to thank you. We spoke beforehand, and one of the things I really enjoyed about our conversation is really just your personality. While you're an academic and obviously you're highly intelligent, you have such a wonderful energy about yourself. And so I couldn't think of anybody better to talk on this topic, because you can present it in a way where a regular person like me can actually understand it and have some fun with it. So thank you so much for that.
Well, thank you. I hope that was the case.
It definitely was. And so thank you again for taking the time to chat. I really do appreciate that. And, bringing this conversation of leading with genuine care to the forefront. It's very important, and we're very passionate about bringing this out to the world. And to all of you that are listening and are loyal to the podcast, or if you're new and you're about to become super loyal, I greatly appreciate you spending time with us today. And in parting, I wish you all much love and gratitude.